I broke it. This chandelier used to be all metal. It was knocked over and the arm broke. I was asked if I could fix it. I couldn't, of course. I honestly don't think that something like this could even be fixed, short of adding some supports, and it would be really ugly. It would become functional again, but most people don't seem to like functional if it's not pretty. And from my understanding, the owner of this really liked this chandelier and they would like to keep using it. So I took it apart and I decided to simply replace that one single piece with a piece of wood. And I was wondering if the combination of metal and wood would look nice. I also had to make it a little thicker because it's not as resistant. And I'd like to show you the whole process. I think it can be interesting for some people because this isn't something that I do. It's not something in which I'm very knowledgeable, but I still dived into it to see how it would go. So I got myself a scrap of wood and I sawed off the big chunks to get rid of them more easily and make the job easier for myself. And then I traced out a little bit more using the original arm so that I don't remove too much wood. That would be very unfortunate. And then I started drilling holes around the place that I didn't want so that I make the job easier for myself. After this, I needed something like a chisel. The problem is that I don't have such a tool. So I decided to sharpen this flat screwdriver that I don't use and that's duplicate anyway, so that it becomes like a chisel. So I started using it. I removed many of the big chunks and it was going quite well until, of course, I broke it. You know, on account of that thing I mentioned about not being very good at this yet. So I had to start over. This chandelier used to be... Nah, I'm just playing. Hey! So I got myself another scrap of wood. It looked like better wood. And this time I was a little bit wiser about it. I didn't take all of the unwanted parts in the same order. I wanted to keep the piece pretty much solid all around. So I removed these parts here and then I decided to get myself an actual chisel. I thought they were expensive on account of how nice they look, those tools. They are beautiful. But you can get cheap chisels from Home Depot. The problem is that you have to be willing to do some extra work. They do not come flat and they're not very sharp most of the time. So I spent about a day flattening my sharpening stone and then I followed some YouTube instructions in order to have a functioning chisel. I was lucky because the YouTube video that I found had used exactly the chisels that I had bought as an example of how to make a cheap chisel work like an expensive one. And it's true. You can make a cheap chisel work like an expensive one with just a little bit of love. So I started chiseling away at some parts. Those round corners, they were kind of tricky, but someone very generous gifted me with a round chisel which made that part a little less difficult. So I kept removing material and this time I did it gradually. More gradually than last time, so that I don't make the same mistake. That would be quite upsetting. So I kept on chiseling away, slowly but surely.
Don't call me Shirley.
And, I mean, look at those shavings. They're quite nice. Then I had to take care of those corners, and I was left with something like this. So now that was my final rough piece, if we can call it that. Kind of looks like a mustache, don't you think? So then, after I kept refining this shape, I ended up with something looking like this. Something that is not symmetrical. I suppose that was to be expected. I've never done this before. So what I did was to draw a grid to help me get things back on track. I wasn't sure if it was even recoverable, but I think that it got close enough for something that would be functional and kind of pretty. I was hoping. So then after all of those small adjustments, I started noticing that the piece would flex every time I clamp it down. So I realized that it was not flat anymore. I don't have a plane, so I had to think of some way to flatten the piece. And so I looked at some more scraps of wood. I used a flat piece of wood, and I used a different piece of plywood which had a mirror on it. And as we all know, mirrors are made from something liquid, and so generally it's going to be flat and level. So with this setup, I could come in with my chisel and use the flat surface as a reference. This is why it's important, well, it's one reason why it's important for the chisel to have been flattened before using. Once I was done with that, I had to carve out 2 corners out of the piece of scrap that I was using as a board, so that I can come in with the file away at the edges of those round corners. I wanted it to look as if it were sharp. I like that look. And so once I was done with that, I had to think of a way to fix the candle holders in this piece. And what I came up with was simply to thread in some dowels, because those pieces have threads inside. And those dowels would then be glued into the wood, which would make it still possible to remove those holders for any sort of maintenance or service or what have you. Then I put the piece back on just to see what it would look like, and it seemed like it was going well and that it would potentially look pretty nice. It's not as solid as the piece of metal, of course. When you press on it, there's a little flexing. And this is not ideal because as you change direction, the fibers do not, which means that in some spots the wood is weaker than other spots, where the stress between the fibers would be directed perpendicularly in relation to the direction of the fibers and would then pull them apart. So I was hoping that it would not make the piece too weak, and I think it's okay. So after all of this very enjoyable wood carving, all I had to do was do some sanding and then apply staining, then sand again and apply a finish for protection. And this is what it looks like. I hope you guys enjoyed this little journey. I hate this word. And I hope that it might have inspired some of you to play with wood. It's a lot of fun. That sounded dirty.
Does anyone have any wood?
I did not mean it that way. This is not that kind of video. So, bye.
I'm going to begin the erection of my settlement. Now, back to our game.
So you were in the middle of an erection?
Oh, of course, it's right here in my hand.